Okay, I think we're live. Thanks for joining, everybody. My name is Michelle Brooks. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Boston lead organizer at the Massachusetts chapter of the Sierra Club. And I'm joined today by Sahidi Panchanta, who is our Boston climate organizing intern for the summer, and has been working on a really exciting mapping project of energy burden in Boston neighborhoods. So I'm going to, without further ado, pass it over to you, Sahidi.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Really quickly before I share my screen, I think I need to be given access for that really quick, and then we can get started.
Yes, okay. Let me make you a co-host, and it looks like we have some more people coming in here. Okay. Welcome, Natasha. Welcome, Celia. You haven't missed anything yet. We're just about to get started with the presentation. So thanks for joining. And Sahidi, maybe if you could just start by introducing yourself as well.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining this Advocacy Hour. My name is Sahidi Achanta. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a rising junior in Boston University studying environmental analysis and policy. And I've been working this summer at the Massachusetts chapter as the Boston organizing intern, and have been working on this project, and I'm very, very excited to share it with all of you. Let me share my presentation now. So in this presentation, I'll be sharing energy burden within Boston and going over the intersecting variables which affect it and how this reflects in the neighborhoods that we see throughout Boston. So first of all, what is energy burden? From the ACE organization, it's defined as the percentage of household income that goes towards energy cost. And this is calculated by the annual utility bill divided by the annual household income. And looking at it nationally, the average energy burden is 3% throughout the US, while for low income households, it's approximately 8.6% as the national average. And energy burden percentages above 6% are considered high, while percentages that are above 10% are considered severe. And when looking at energy burden, we see that it disproportionately affects BIPOC households, and studies show a consistent overlap with variables such as high eviction rates, renting, health afflictions, and redlining, historical redlining. One quote which I wanted to share during this presentation to start us off is by Sharonda Williams-Tack, who is the Associate Director of the Sierra Club Energy Justice Campaign. And she stated, "At its core, reducing energy burden is about justice. It prioritizes the needs of folks whose society has ignored throughout history. Your zip code shouldn't be the determining factor in how much you pay for power, yet the most energy burden communities are often the same communities who experience racist redlining." And now going into that, I wanted to share the project that we've been working on that I want to share for this presentation, which is an interactive tool that measures energy burden. This is developed through Tableau, and it's an interactive tool. So right now, in the standalone picture that you see on the right, you can't see every single neighborhood title, but you can see that once you go into the website link. And hopefully if we have enough time after this presentation, I can do a quick demo on how to use the tool and how it goes over the different neighborhoods and the statistics that it shows. But this mapping tool measures energy burden, and it also measures racial demographics, median household income, eviction rates, and asthma rates in the US, as well as the accompanying poverty rates. And we use this tool to assess the impact of energy burden on Boston neighborhoods. And our goal in developing these maps is to use the information to assist volunteers in our advocacy for energy justice and show how these variables intersect and how they impact energy burden and energy justice. With that, these are some of the key takeaways that we observed from the Tableau map and the data that we compiled and used to create it. So the two main points that are focused on the main energy burden map for Boston is the average energy burden per neighborhood, and also the energy burden for those that fall below the average annual income for Boston, which is around 76,000 according to the 2020 census. And we see a 3% increase in energy burden for those that fall under this average annual income. And this demonstrates the struggle that low-income households face in paying these energy bills. Most neighborhoods, excluding many of the boroughs near downtown Boston, have a higher energy burden rate of about 6% or higher, which, as referenced in previous slides, is capped for maximum affordability. But the higher income neighborhoods of Boston have about a 1 to 2.5 average energy burden overall, and that's less than the national average, showing that many of these neighborhoods that are more affluent don't have a struggle in paying these energy and utility bills the way that low-income communities do. So now I wanted to examine how different variables intersect with energy burden, because after all, energy justice is an intersectional issue, and comparing these effects helps us understand the root issues that affect energy burden. So first off, please let me know, by the way, if you can read the title up above. It might be blocking it due to Zoom. Great. So the first map that we want to demonstrate is racial demographics. And the map that you see on the left-hand side is focusing on the non-white residents of these different neighborhoods. And you can see the percentages and the different concentrations according to the legend there. And it's compared to the energy burden map that you see on the right-hand side. And then this map, which is pulled from Brendan Pierpoint's map that he developed to look at racial demographics through majorities in Boston, and comparing that to energy burden. You can see the different demographics and which majorities are more prevalent in which areas of Boston. But we see here that neighborhoods that have a higher percentage of Black and Latinx residents have higher energy burden, as shown in the previous map, making this another climate justice issue which disproportionately affects BIPOC households, putting them in those frontline communities. And a quote that I want to share from an ACE study says, compared to white or non-Hispanic households, Black households spend 43% more of their income on energy costs, and Hispanic households spend 20% more than their white residents. So now breaking down the racial demographic data that we've seen in those maps, we see that there's a greater rate of energy burden in communities with more racial diversity. Specifically, we see this in the more southeastern parts of Boston, specifically neighborhoods like Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan neighborhoods. And this is an effect of racial housing segregation. And due to this historical segregation, these neighborhoods have older, inefficient homes that result in higher energy burden. The houses in predominantly BIPOC neighborhoods often contain outdated appliances that attribute to their energy burden when compared to predominantly white neighborhoods, which have less energy burden and arguably higher quality households when looking at historical housing segregation. And another quote from ACE states that they found that low-income African-American, Latinx, and renters pay up to 3 times more than the average household on home energy cost, looking at this nationally. But we can definitely apply this to neighborhoods in Boston. And please let me know if you want to go back to the map. I'll go back to it right now just to reflect on the data that we've seen and the analysis that we were able to make from it. Now continuing on to eviction rates compared to energy burden, we see that there's a higher concentration of eviction rates in those same neighborhoods where we saw that there was higher racial diversity. And eviction rates are higher in those neighborhoods that have high energy burden. And we can assume that this comes from the burden of higher energy bills that these households have to pay. And it's a large contributing factor to increased eviction rates. And one very big factor that plays into the higher eviction rates is the fact that landowners and landlords are not required to maintain the most up-to-date energy systems. This is a more regional policy, but it's not implemented in many big urban cities. It's something now that is being demanded by renters and those that are in these neighborhoods that don't have up-to-date energy systems, but there is no law that requires landlords to maintain these standards. And so then this places the health and safety burdens of those inefficient energy systems on renters. And without efficient homes, communities struggle to pay bills, which leads to an unfair eviction rates in places with higher energy burden and lower annual income. Now, looking at household income on that matter, we can see in this map, the first percentage that you see underneath the neighborhood names is the poverty rate in those neighborhoods, the average poverty rate. And then directly below that, you'll see the average median household income for those neighborhoods. And depending on what that household income may be, it's darker if it's less, and it's lighter if they have more affluent, higher income. And on the right, again, you can see energy burden in comparison. You can see a lot of the concentrations are similar, and there's a lot of common overlap between these maps. And within household income, those high income households are concentrated in neighborhoods that are closer to downtown Boston. And the households with lower median income are the same communities that we've observed in the previous maps that have higher energy burden. And these low income households can't afford their own energy system since they are renters, and that power falls on landlords. 59% of low income households nationally are renters, and the power to change energy system lies with those landlords and property owners. Even if these communities do own their homes, the upgrade costs are often too high and out of reach due to their income. And a quote from energy.gov states that energy efficiency and weatherization measures not only help to lower energy bills, but also improve indoor air quality and safety, thereby positively impacting human health. Speaking of human health, we're now moving on to our next and last variable, which is asthma rates. And we can see that there's a very large amount of asthma rates throughout those neighborhoods, again, compared to the right, that do have higher energy burden compared to the neighboring neighborhoods. And we can see that the concentrations for these two rates are very similar. In asthma rates, we can see a higher concentration in issues like health, income, and energy burden, repeating because households that are low income have to make trade-offs for health costs and vital care due to their high utility and energy bills, which leads to worsening conditions like asthma. A lot of these trade-offs may be that someone may decline medical care because they need to devote that money to go to their utility cost. Additionally, it can be that someone refuses to or lessens their use of those utilities, such as heat and air conditioning in times when we have very large heat or cold waves that we see throughout Boston, in order to reduce their utility and energy bills that they get at the end of the month, which also puts them at risk for health conditions. And a quote from ACE states that high energy burdens are correlated with greater risk for respiratory diseases, increased stress, and economic hardships. These communities also experience acute systematic inequalities, barriers, and limited access to public and private resources, again, due to the trade-offs that they have to make in order to pay their utility bills. And reducing energy burden could lead to better health outcomes as they can have more disposable income in order to meet their needs. Now, this is a correlation graph that was created by Emma Brown, and it's a great way of showing a lot of the correlation that we see within these statistics that we just measured on these maps. And just to explain the graph, you can see that the larger dots within this that are red tend towards a negative correlation, while the larger ones that are blue go to a positive correlation. So looking at racial demographics, we see that Black and Latinx populations have a high correlation with energy burden and eviction rates, while white residents see a negative correlation with energy burden and eviction, thus showing how the two communities are very different in their relationship with energy burden and the amount of income that they need to use in order to meet their needs and pay these utility bills. Then moving on to eviction rates, neighborhoods with high energy burden have higher eviction rates, and neighborhoods that have average or high median income have lower eviction rates. And those who rent see much higher eviction rates than those who own. And then moving on to household income, we see that those that fall into an area with a high poverty rate have subsequent low income, and those that have a higher energy burden also have a higher poverty rate and lower median household income. And we can see that these variables often correlate as they did in the math shown previously. And then looking at asthma and health, we see neighborhoods that have higher asthma rates also have higher eviction rates, lower income, and more Black and Latinx residents. And these residents often have to make trade-offs, as said earlier, in order to pay for these bills. So now looking at all of this data and looking at the variables and how they intersect, looking at the next steps that we can take from this, we see that systematic issues like race, income, and health are clearly linked to energy burden, and therefore public policy and systematic change is the most effective way to remedy this issue and create long-term change. Landlords specifically must be held accountable for their impact on their tenants by ensuring that they are making the most efficient energy systems and lowering the cost that renters have to pay for energy and utility bills. Renewable energy has proven to be a very effective way to reduce energy costs and increase affordability. The EPA's saw that this measure was in fact true in looking at California's MASH program, where they were 2,600 tenants in this case study saw a decrease in $480 in their energy bill after installing solar panels after only 1 year of installing those solar panels. And this greatly reduced their energy burden. And we can see that this would likely decrease the energy burden in Boston residents' households as well. And what can we do as volunteers and people that are advocating for energy justice and trying to improve energy burden? The first thing and the most major thing that we can do as volunteers is to educate communities on their options for efficient energy use and weatherization. The Boston Green New Deal Coalition is actually having an energy workshop and weatherization workshop on September 13th at 5 p.m. The registration link is linked here and can be sent out after this. But this is really helpful in order to show communities their options in how they can reduce their energy burden and how they can better efficiently use their appliances or use their energy bills and energy systems in order to improve how much they need to pay for those bills. Additionally, advocating for renewable energy installation will greatly improve energy systems in communities who currently do not have proper ownership rights or rental agreements which allow for this. And then through that renewable energy installation, we can see that in the long term and short term, we can decrease energy burden for many communities. Next, pushing policymakers to support renters by holding landowners accountable for their responsibility to reduce energy burden for their tenants. Through this issue of energy burden, we see that the housing crisis and housing issues that fall under that have a great overlap with energy justice and energy burden, and these two intersect very often. So by pushing policymakers to advocate for renters, we can see that this can greatly improve energy justice as well. And finally, providing increased resources to communities that experience high energy burden through utility relief programs and mutual aid funds is a great short-term way for us volunteers to make sure that those households and communities that struggle to currently pay for those utility and energy bills can find a way to decrease their burden. Although this is not a long-term solution, this is a short-term way that we can see energy burden decrease for those households that are struggling and are above that 6% and cap of maximum affordability. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Does anybody have any questions after that?
Well, let me just first start by saying thank you, Sahidi, for showing us your research. That was a lot of information and very interesting and insightful and useful for our advocacy in Boston.
Of course, thank
So
you.
with that, oh, I think I saw someone's hand go up. Natasha.
Yeah, I have like 2 experiences with this. Great presentation. You were really amazing. I am a landlord, and I also tried to run a mass save campaign in my town and targeted landlords. And, the problem is the landlords don't pay the energy bills. So if you're trying to do anything expensive, like I did eventually replace windows in my unit, but it was $4,000. And when you're getting like 2,000 profit a year on your unit, that's like not getting any cash flow for a couple of years. So, not only a fund for renters, but I think there should be a fund for the landlords so they can afford some of these upgrades. I mean, Mass Save does do insulation and other things, but I don't know if it's like that easy for renters. I think they have to get the landlord to agree to it and all that. So it's vitally important what you're saying. I think I try to convince the landlords that they would get renters to stay, because people do move out. Like if the energy costs are too high, they're not going to stay. So that's one angle I think one can try to approach these landlords. But I'm wondering what Mayor Wu is thinking about what you said, because it is a matter of the landlords making improvements that make the house more valuable. But if they don't want to spend the money, then I think we've got to convince the city they have to do some grants or something for this work.
Yeah, definitely, Natasha. Thank you so much for that input. I agree that I think that these new energy installation systems are out of reach, not only for renters, but also for landlords in many different areas of the US and in Boston. And one way that public policy and policymakers can improve this can most definitely be by doing grants and doing subsidies on these renewable energy systems in order to make them more accessible for renters and landlords alike. So thank you so much for that.
Folks have other questions or comments for Sahidi, or things that they would like to see again? Oh, I see Dan's hand, and then Edward.
Sahidi, great presentation. I learned a lot there, and I was especially interested in the tool that you use. And you mentioned you might be able to give us a demo. So totally fine if we wait until after questions for that, but I would love to get the link or see a little bit more about that tool.
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you so much, Dan. I can definitely do a quick demo right now in order to, if I can get out of this. Oh my God, in order to show how to use the tool. So this is the link. It's public on Tableau, so anyone can access it. Once you reach the site, the first site that you're going to see is the energy burden map. And when you go over the neighborhood, it'll give you the name, the average energy burden for that neighborhood, and then the low income energy burden for those households under the average income. And you can go over all of the different neighborhoods and see how they compare. If you look at places like downtown, you can see that they have a very low energy burden, even for those households that fall under the low income energy burden. It's only 3.95%. But when you go to places like Dorchester, Mattapaton, or Roxbury, then it's much higher. Oh my gosh. great. And then going at some of the other tabs, you can see median household income has the energy burden statistics there for you to compare with what the other variables measure, such as the median household income and then the average poverty rate. This map here specifically is showing the concentrations of the median household income for these neighborhoods. And then similarly, it shows that for eviction rates here, we don't see that much of a, I guess, variability in the eviction rates here, but it is really useful to compare how low the eviction rates are in neighborhoods that we show have higher racial diversity and otherwise. And one really useful tool under the racial demographics map is looking at the different breakdown of the racial demographics for each race respectively, considering that they're non-white. And you can see that breakdown there. And it's really useful to compare this and see the different concentrations of which communities have, I guess, majority within those demographics. And then if you wanted to see the data by itself and kind of do a side-by-side comparison, at the very last tab here, you have a data overview where you can look at all of the different variables, which I just presented on, and the associating neighborhood on the left-hand side, and the different percentages or whatever variables that you'd like to compare. It's really easy to navigate, hopefully very accessible for those that are hoping to do research.
Thank you, Sahidi. And I just want to mention, and then I'm going to pass it over to Edward just for folks know, or so folks know, the tool itself that the Sierra Club, one of our data analysts in the Sierra Club created, is a map of the entire US, but the way that this data is broken down is by individual census tracts in each state. So this project required a lot of time and a lot of work on Sahidi's part to work with our national data team on how we would be able to show these different variables and energy burden rates broken down by neighborhoods in Boston, which is what we were interested in specifically looking at. So I'm very appreciative and proud of the work that you've done, Sahidi, because this was certainly not an easy task, learning to use a completely new data set and spend a lot of time working with the data here. So Edward, can I pass it to you?
Yeah, just a quick question. How does the cost of something like a heat pump compare with other kinds of electrification?
Thank you, Edward. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to do research on the different appliances or different replacements for those energy systems in order to reduce energy burden. It's definitely something that I would like to do in the future, to dive deeper into this topic and find more feasible replacements and solutions for this topic. Unfortunately, I don't have that data or know that off the top of my head.
Can you, I'm wondering if there might be someone else on the call here who has an answer for that. Can you repeat what you said, Edward? You said the cost of heat pumps versus what?
Yeah, versus other kinds of electrification.
Are there, like, what other kinds of electrification are you thinking about?
I'm not sure, I guess.
I wonder if Jess or Dan might have something to share on that.
Yeah, I can address that. So when we talk about electrification, oftentimes we're talking about changing over particularly when it comes to buildings, are heating systems over to electric systems. And heat pumps are one of the most common technologies to do that. There are different types. I mean, I could get into a long conversation about heat pumps, but it's essentially, whether you're doing, depending on the size of building, a heat pump is going to cost a different amount. Commercial, residential, and then we're talking large multifamily or single family homes. The prices vary quite a bit from type to type. The recent Inflation Reduction Act that was passed by the federal government has a huge amount of money for heat pumps and heat pump incentives. I believe it's up to $8,000 per unit of a rebate, which is huge, and I think is going to be a game changer in terms of making heat pumps as a technology much more affordable, bringing them to scale. And then that in turn will bring down costs overall. So
That's very exciting. We've been hearing about heat pump technology and talking about it for a number of years now. So making it more accessible and providing those incentives for folks to switch over, super exciting, especially because we know it's cleaner and better for us in so many ways in terms of the air we're breathing in our homes and our workplaces, and the costs that we're paying for our energy bills, which can be so, easily fluctuated dependent on seasons here and fuel costs. So yeah, we know that they're a great alternative and that they can be affordable. Celia, did you have a comment or question? I thought I saw your hand earlier.
Yeah, you did. I had a couple. One is just a clarification. First of all, Sahidi, this was terrific. So thank you so much for all the hard work that you did. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody else did as well. On your first slide, you had some averages of income versus usage that would equal energy burden, and this it? Yeah. So I just didn't get to jot this down before you did it. So it was 3%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
It's a low end, right?
Mm-hmm. So currently, the national average for energy burden is 3%, and that's considered average or like low to average, while 6% is capped at the maximum affordability for around the US, and then above 10% is considered severe.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so we think of it as anything above 6% is considered a high energy burden rate. And certainly above 10 is severe. And that's when you start to see and hear about situations, where folks are having to consider these unfortunate trade-offs that pose risks to health, such as trying to not use their heat in the winter and instead just use the oven or something to heat their space. And yeah, different things like that. So, we're already thinking about how we can use this information for our advocacy, such as studies that we're seeing. Like recently we were looking at a renters study for I think it was like the Mass Save draft renters plan, about which communities are being considered like environmental justice communities, and looking at, we think that energy burden rates should also be a considered factor when looking at communities who are really being targeted or overburdened by our fossil fuel energy systems, and who should be prioritized for the benefits of these programs.
Yeah, that was my other question too, was, how are we going to be using this going forward? So thank you for that.
Certainly. Yeah, and the Green New Deal Coalition, as Sahidi mentioned, we're organizing a workshop that's primarily we're looking to have attendees who maybe are being, who have a higher energy burden, as an example, to learn about the options that are available through energy efficiency and weatherization programs and incentives. So that's coming up on September 13th. It's going to be a hybrid event, so there'll be an in-person location and Zoom. I see your hand, Jess.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add that here in Massachusetts, our utility structure is really not working for us, not working for residents in terms of paying their utility bills. We have, I think it was, I just looked it up, and it's 200, as of this past December, 240,000 people. No, sorry, 281,000 households in Massachusetts were more than 90 days behind on utility bills. And that number, which has always been higher than it should be, really went through the roof with COVID. And so a lot of people are not only extremely burdened, but also behind on their utilities and in danger of having, power shut off. It's one of the reasons, and I just want to flag this, because one of the reasons that we advocate so strongly for low income heat assistance programs is because of these folks. Many of these folks are people who are energy burdened, and so it's one of the reasons we include advocacy for low income heating, both at the state level and making use of federal funds.
Yeah, thank you so much for that input, Jess. One thing which was really prevalent that kept showing up, especially in recent studies about energy burden, is just how much this issue has been exacerbated due to the pandemic. And it really shows us how much low-income households and certain demographics really struggle with keeping up with utility bills, especially since we've been locked inside for about 2 years. So it really magnifies the issue and shows which demographics are struggling the most.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because I think, did we say the data that we're basing these maps off of, is it from the 2020 census data?
Yeah, it is 2020 census.
Yeah. So it'd be interesting to see how much things have changed throughout the last couple of years in the pandemic. But I think we already know, just based on the ground examples that we're hearing about and seeing. Does anybody else have questions or thoughts or feedback? Yeah, Natasha, I see you.
Well, I think during this hearing, it would be interesting to see Massey approach to the heat pumps and said that you weren't entitled unless you did a complete house transition and you didn't have any kind of oil or gas. And some of us have kept our older heating system sort of like a backup, because the heat pumps don't work that well if it gets really cold, if it's like below 10 degrees. So if your furnace is working somewhat, and it's no reason to yank it out if it's working and can be used during those really cold temperatures. So I think that's another area that, because I know the Boston Globe keeps saying only 460 houses have converted to heat pumps. And in my own town, we had 100. And I'm always arguing with the Boston Globe, like, why are you saying this ridiculous number? Because my town is very small. So I think that's another thing to, some people say, I only live in 2 rooms for most of the time. I don't go in these other rooms. So I'll pay for the heat pumps for these couple of rooms, but I don't want to pay for like 5 heads or whatever. So I think that's something we need to push back as well, because if you used to order $2,000 worth of oil and you're only, getting $200, it's still an 80% improvement on what you're burning. So that's kind of been my questioning of why the state is taking such a strict approach on these energy conversions.
Natasha, I can speak to that. It's a position that the Sierra Club Massachusetts supports, full electrification. And the reason is because a lot of the times those backup systems are gas. Not always, obviously, but many of the ones that people are trying to keep are gas. And keeping gas in our homes continues the gas infrastructure, which the costs of which transition, sort of shift to people who are still stuck on gas, and away from people who just have it as a backup, but have to maintain that infrastructure so that it can be delivered to the people who have it as a backup. And so it's not economical, and it's also bad in terms of maintaining and perpetuating our gas, our fracked gas based heating system in Massachusetts, which we're trying to move off of. In terms of, heating oils, I mean, it's definitely, that doesn't have the same problems. When you get into heating oil, you come up with a whole other set of issues, right, in terms of pollution. And obviously it is more expensive, like you said. The programs just don't exist the way that they need to retrofit homes to move fully off of fossil fuels. And because what you're pointing out is very real, right? Like, heat pumps are great, and they do work in cold climates. I mean, there are many homes in Maine that are powered solely by heat pump. This is totally possible. But we also need to be retrofitting our homes to make them more energy efficient, because that is what makes the heat pump be able to work. And we just don't have the programs and the money for residents to retrofit their homes. It's a huge undertaking. And so one of the Sierra Club Massachusetts's biggest priorities this past legislative session, excuse me, and moving forward as well, is setting up those programs to retrofit homes and making sure that there is funding allocated for those so that people are able to do it without suffering financially. So it's a really big part of what we advocate for. And I totally hear you that it is extremely frustrating when the infrastructure doesn't exist.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks, Natasha, for bringing up that point. Yeah. All right, folks. Well, thank you again for joining the presentation today. We hope that you found it very informative, and yeah, we'll keep you posted on what comes next with our energy burden work. Future Advocacy Hour, most likely. So with that, I think we can close out.
Thank you so much.
Sahidi.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.